Starting my speech in three, two, one. The speech is going to be very simple. When we talk about economic crises and why the reason why we prefer individuals to be living in an autocracy rather than a democracy at times when you have an economic crisis, be it because of like some sort of like supply chain shortages, or be it because of like some like unforeseen event like the pandemic. The point here is, and the comparative and the tipping point that we're relying on at opening government is that you are in a much better position to make the most decisive steps and at the most earliest stages of the economic crisis in an autocracy to get yourself in a position to get out of that crisis, and even more importantly to make sure that the people within your country and within your community are best taken care of, and the general environment around that during that time of that crisis is a much better one on the comparative. With that said, we're going to show to you three things broadly within this speech in which we'll show to you why the nature of why this is going to be better in autocracies. Firstly, we'll tell you what is the nature of like these economic crises themselves, and then we'll tell you why it's important to have a degree of control within these countries at times of economic crises, and then thirdly we'll tell you why you lose out on this important control on the comparative when it's democracies. And if I have time, I'll talk about like long-term incentives. If not, Tha will talk about it. Firstly, what are we talking about when we talk about economic crises, and what do they essentially look like, and what's the most important thing when we're talking about them? The major issue that countries face in terms of economic crises is the capital flight that they experience at the onset of the crisis, i.e. when you are in a crisis, or when you are in a position where you are experiencing an economic downturn, or when you have a specific industry that is struggling. What happens is that major investors are essentially going to try to pull their capital out of that community or that country. This is something that was attempted to happen within China when they recently had their economical downturn and their real estate crisis, namely with the example of Evergrande. But the thing is, because China has more central control and is more central control of their government, they can essentially pass on laws and can essentially stifle the ability of these investors to take their capital out. The difference on the comparative over here is that in democracies, you have to pass legislation and go through a process through which you can essentially put in measures to effectively stop this like capital flight from like leaving your country. This is something which is very important, because at the state in which you are going to make sure that these investors and that money at the time of the crisis is going to stay within that country, your position to get out of that crisis is far greater, because you can invest that money that these individuals and these investors would have otherwise taken out of the country onto the very people who are suffering at the time of the economic crisis. Because you might have food shortages, and you might have like other shortages or other amenities that you might necessarily need, but at the point at which you allow this capital flight to happen, especially at the onset of the economic crisis, which is what's going to happen if these individuals are living in a democracy, the repercussions in the state's ability to essentially make sure that you essentially get your basic needs is much limited, and to make sure that those industries themselves survive. So the real estate industry was in China was able to recover much better and much quicker in comparison to the United States real estate crisis, because of the simple fact that they had this control and they did not allow all investors to essentially speculate or essentially take that capital flight outside of the country. The second thing that I essentially want to talk about is why avoiding panic is important, and how crucially, these autocratic nations have the mechanisms and the tools available for them to avoid this panic. And the reasoning for this is because they run the mass majority of state resources and are in control of the state resources that essentially dictate the way in which these individuals are essentially going to interact with the economical crisis. So for instance, in a democracy, when you are in a position of an economical crisis, the media has an incentive to sensationalize how bad the crisis is. It's going to sensationalize how ill-fit the government is in terms of like solving it, how they were essentially the cause of it, even if that's not necessarily the case, because an economic crisis doesn't even necessarily have to be caused by the government. We've told you in our introduction how there can be external factors towards it as well. The point over here is that the media is probably going to be better regulated. You're going to probably dish out messages that are more aligned with what the state is trying to actively do. But most importantly, it's going to make sure that consumers and people in general don't go into a state of economic panic, which is only going to exacerbate the conflict further, because that only attracts further capital flight if you allow the media to, like, report whatever they want on the economic crisis, sensationalize it, and glorify it to that extent. The second thing over here is that you have control over stuff like police and like energy resources, so you can like curb resentment, or you can curb any rebellion that might potentially be coming up. We're not necessarily saying that unrest or something like this is something that you would be doing consistently throughout the point of the economic crisis. This is a short-term measure, but it's a measure that is nevertheless required and necessary, especially at the onset of the economic crisis when it's starting. The third thing that I would like to mention over here is that because you have control over all of these resources, what you essentially can do is make sure that they're distributed in a much more equitable manner. And before I go on further, I'll take a point from closing.
Yeah, what caused the Asian financial crisis?
I mean, a variety of things can cause the Asian financial crisis. You can explain them in your speech, I guess. Comparatively, why are democracies worse off? Democracies on the comparative are worse off because legislation is slow, and because democratic parties are much more prone to the concerns of these lobbyists as in the first place. So lobbyists can exert much more pressure in a democracy compared to an autocracy, which is problematic. And the other thing that happens is over here is that the political parties themselves have an incentive to make sure to not essentially pass through legislation that can essentially make that crisis, alleviate the crisis to a certain extent. We saw the Democratic Party doing this with the Republicans essentially halting or stifling legislation to make sure that Donald Trump bears the brunt of the blame for the stuff that was happening during the COVID-19 pandemic. So because of these perverse incentives that parties have against each other, that's something that is problematic as well. Very quickly, lastly, I think Taha will expand upon this further, but this also makes states better at making long-term decisions, because the autocratic government is probably in greater control, can formulate a plan with much more certainty at the point at which you don't have all of this panic happening in status quo. And because of all of those reasons, please vote for OG.
I thank the speaker for that kind of speech. Maybe have a leader proposition case for the opening up.
Hello, am I audible? All good? Awesome. Give me like 10 seconds. Two very simple arguments from O. Firstly, as to why most likely the response from autocrats is going to be the shock doctrine, where you privatize, where you cut social services, where you deregulate, and actually creates worse economic impacts. Second argument, in most cases during autocracies, you get mass social revolution. That is the worst kind of scenarios to actually live in, because you get mass instability, mass repression, and mass violence. First thing, then let's talk about like the conditions and the responses that most autocracies actually use in response to economic crisis. The first thing I want to note here is who are the actual decision makers in majority of the autocracies. These are elite that are incredibly important for the sustenance of the autocracy. These are people like businessmen, people like oil moguls, people like other businessmen who control other corporations and control the business interests, who are incredibly wealthy, who give money and funds to the ruling elite and the ruling autocrats. Two, these are also people who have like very important interests with regards to controlling other state resources. So they have incentives to control things like public services. They have incentives to control things like natural resources that don't have control over right now. These are elites who have profit incentives, right? The reason why these people are so important right now is most likely autocrats control their countries through like subsidiaries, right? So they use local elite, local like warlords or so on to control those areas, to control and like make sure that their control is actually legitimized and actually are able to actually carry out their policies, right? Most likely these people are the people who are like warlords, who are like the inner circle of the autocrats. Like you can look at places like Libya, where all the ruling elite were like very close associates and relations with Assad. These are the people who are most important in the decision-making process during the time of crisis. What do these people then care about? It is very simply profit and being able to sustain themselves and getting more money to themselves and increasing their control and increasing the luxuries they have, while also ensuring that they don't lose the luxuries and the control and the economic facilities and the luxuries they have right now. What then are the policies that most autocrats will actually pass during times of economic crisis? Three things here. One, you're going to get mass amount of privatization. How is this going to happen? This privatization is going to happen where public services are going to be given with regards to public services control is going to be transferred with regards to these elites, with regards to these businessmen. They're just going to get control over it because they've always wanted control over it, right? When you privatize it, that is when you have to increase the prices for this because you're going to stimulate the economy by increasing prices with regards to things like social services, right? But two, you're going to cut welfare, you're going to cut taxes because these are all the things that business individuals want as well, right? They want to cut corporate taxes, they want to increase their profit margins, they want to increase the amount of money they can actually take home and actually keep it themselves, not necessarily caring about taxes, right? So you're also going to get a massive reduction. I'll take you around 430, yeah? Don't worry. With regards to increasing taxes and all those things, right? But three, you're going to cut social welfare as well. You don't care about social spending. You want to entrench your control. So you're most likely going to pay off more military officers. You're going to cut social spending. You're going to cut things like welfare, right? Why are all these things incredibly problematic during crisis? I think this worsens the ground realities for the most people on the ground. You make things like food more expensive. You make things like the most vulnerable, even less ability, like give them less ability to access things like resources. You make them make public services more like public services like water and electricity also incredibly inaccessible and inefficient, right? And the nuance here is very, very simple. After these policies are done, they're entrenched, and it's unlikely even after the crisis to actually change them because the people who are the decision makers, people who are the elite have no incentive to actually change them, right? What is the comparative? Why is governments which are democratic actually able to do things much better? The first thing is I think they're simply able to get more money from the international community. In most cases of economic crisis, there's either due to a lack of reserves or any other thing, you need a fund of money and resources and aid coming in from organizations like the IMF and other countries, right? Why is it simply more likely for you to get those resources when you're in a democracy? Most likely, you already meet a lot of IMF conditions. IMF considers your democratic index. They care about the degree to which there's corruption and degree to which there's like human rights, degree to which there's like legal representation and so on. Those are some of the most important conditions the IMF cares about when they're providing loans. Those things aren't there in autocracies. So it's very difficult for autocracies to get that aid. Most likely, you're not going to get money from the US and other allies either because they don't want to give money to any other autocratic regime because it goes against the ideas of liberalism and so on, right? So you literally have no other option but cutting down, but actually go and entrenching your power using things like repression. The second thing is I think you just do stimulus. You just increase the amount of money that is going into the economy. You supply money and so on, right? And I think another piece of nuance that is incredibly important is the degree to which you have technical expertise to do that. I think simply democracies have greater technical experience because they have things like independent central banks, because they have more technical expertise and people who are actually having this experience staying in this country, right? Autocracies don't have that because you want to flee the country because you never know, then you will be blamed for a problem. Then you will be the person who's going to have to take the bullet when the government fucks up and the autocracy fucks up, right? The comparative is very, very simple. In their world, they haven't actually characterized what most autocracies actually look like. They're incredibly problematic. They don't really use the same technical experience. They don't have the resources to getting funds from the international community. All of this means in this scenario, just in itself, economically, democracies are better able to solve these problems. Before I go on to the second argument,
Yeah. Millet is planning on privatizing most government corporations, cut the value of pensions by 40%, created a massive recession, and cut almost all welfare, as well as to pass huge taxes.
Perfect.
Why does he have to do this? And why do you think only autocrats do the things you said?
Yeah, I'll go to this in my second argument, right? The second argument is simply about what the response is from the people and why it's going to flow down to mass instability, right? The first thing I want to note here is that democracies has a multiplicities of accountability mechanisms. The first thing is you have a devolution of power and division of power into legislatures, executives, and judiciaries, right? So you can't carry out mass amount of change without the support of important part of the judiciary and with important part of the legislature. So you need to create things like coalitions. You need to get mass amount of public support, right? But the second thing is when there's protests within a democracy in response to these policies, you can't just repress them because you can't utilize the military because the military is in most cases independent. Your military is also important. The people who are in the military when they carry out repression will be prosecuted as well. So you can't just simply use the military to repress people. That is where the comparative is very important. In the comparative, autocracy has every ability to use the military repression for two reasons. One, most likely the military guard are their own relations. They've done this because they want to prevent things like coups because they have control over the military. But two, most likely they fund the most amount of money from their governments to the military. So they personally fund them. So they have personal control over the military decision makers and the military officers on the ground. What then is the response that's going to happen when you get mass protests? on the side of democracies. In most cases, even when you think of places like Peru, you most likely want to respond with listening to the demands of the people, with listening to the demands of technocrats and experts who actually want to serve the people, because you don't want to get taken out of power. The comparative is with regards to dictatorships, you can continuously use repression. You can continuously use repression because there's no accountability. People, when they're poor and hungry, don't have the ability to actually fight against your military, so they can just continuously repress them and kill them until you go into mass instability, right? The weighing here is very, very simple. On both sides, you'll have protests. The response to protests on our side will simply be more repressive and harmful.
I thank the speaker for that fine speech. Also, could the spectator rename themselves to their original name, please? Everyone should know who is watching them, okay? Having said that, maybe have the Deputy Prime Minister close the pickup case.
Can I be seen and heard?
Yes, you both. Spectator, please rename yourself.
Wonderful. I will take POIs in the chat. Let me just set my screen up so I can actually see the chat. Okay, wonderful. Right, starting now. The major thrust of opening opposition's case is that autocracies were going to make bad decisions because they're largely governed by elites and aren't interested in solving the crisis the same way democracies are. Let's deal with this before we get into anything else. Their major claim here is because autocracies rely on systems of power sharing throughout regional power centers, it is necessary for them to concede things to local elites, otherwise they're not going to achieve anything. This is their mechanism for privatization. This is their mechanism for cutting taxes, for social welfare. I want you to know there is nothing independent about any of these. None of them have been mechanized as having anything to do with solving the crisis. They're all exclusively to do with what power brokers are going to want from the autocracy during the crisis. A couple of responses then. First of all, I see no reason that these things should actualize during crisis. If this is in fact true, then autocracy should have a permanent and constant incentive to cut taxes, cut social welfare, and give up and privatize everything. They've given me no reason to believe that these intensify during crisis because they've given me no reason to believe that autocracies want to solve crisis. Secondly, I think this is generally not true of modern autocracies because the way they're painting them as though they're feudal systems in which kings have reliance on deep power sharing networks with a bunch of feudals. This is not the case. Many autocracies are genuinely very centralized, and power is not a bargain between the center and the others. It is an agreement in which the others are the ones who are trying to vie for a little bit of the power that the center has. The CCP is not on the losing end of bargains with any regional power broker inside China. There aren't any meaningful regional power brokers in China who are able to compete with the CCP. What this means then, it is what the autocratic center wants which matters. And because we've been given no reason to believe that they have an incentive to suddenly privatize, cut taxes and social welfare during times of crisis, I see no reason to believe what it is that opening opposition has said so far. In fact, we can give you a different analysis here on why both democracies and autocracies are likely to eventually take similar actions in response to crises. Autocracies are just likely to take them faster and more efficiently. Firstly, though, why are they likely to take similar actions? And those actions are, of course, geared at trying to solve the crisis. A couple of reasons. First of all, because both rely on local consent. Yes, democracies rely on them more directly because you need to be voted in, but autocracies also rely on not being overthrown and having enough public buy-in, on having enough people, like even your local power brokers, if you want to go that far, are reliant on smaller groups of local individuals then who in turn support them. So autocracies require local consent, which means they require people to actually want to support them and have them around, or at the very least not be sick of them. This is one incentive why they're going to solve the crisis and not let the common man be destroyed underfoot. But secondly, it's also the only way to access international aid, which we accept is one of the only ways out of this recession, right? China is not going to pump money into you when you're randomly cutting taxes and doing nothing with it, just like sort of jerking your dick around. It's not going to be useful money. So the only way to access international aid is if you can prove as an autocracy that you are taking the decisions necessary to do something about the crisis. Crucially, then, what this means is both autocracies and democracies want to achieve the same ends. They're going to take whichever economic steps are necessary to solve the crisis, whatever the nature of that crisis may happen to be. Why then are autocracies able to make better decisions about how to solve this crisis? It's because they're more efficient, decisive, and avoid coordination problems. Autocracies have centralized power. This means you don't have to go through consultative processes with parliaments and regional federations. They have reduced checks and balances, which means you don't have to wait before passing any piece of legislation. Crucially, this is very critical in cases of local capital flight, because if somebody with a businessman is about to run away with all of their money, you need the law which allows you to seize and freeze their assets before they do that. Democracies may be delayed in passing the emergency legislation necessary for something like this. Autocracies can go ahead and do this because they don't care about checks and balances. Autocracies also don't have to worry about public input before they make decisions, again enabling them to be able to take quick, efficient decisions, the same ones democracies would, just too late. They also avoid the coordination problem because you don't need to wrangle between the interests of opposing actors, because the autocrat and whatever cabinet they have does not need to worry about this in the short term. They can overrule them. Long term, yes, I admit there will always be consequences. There is some degree of power sharing involved in any network, but in the short term, you can overrule and take the necessary actions to solve the problem, which, as we pointed out, the autocrat is going to need to do. But furthermore, they also have more direct control over the resources
necessary to resort to be able to fix these things. So for instance, if there's a supply chain crisis, autocracies can immediately intervene into the local economy, reshuffle supply chains, redivert energy to the sectors which need it most if you have any sort of power shortage, use policy tools in a way that democracies can only dream of because they do not have the capacity or speed or buy-in to be able to do this sort of thing. But on top of that, we also tell you one of the major issues inside a crisis is that it's self-replicating. A crisis can start off relatively mundane, whatever the nature of that crisis may be, but all crises have one thing in common. They start causing a lack of consumer and investor confidence, both of which then lead to bank runs and capital flight respectively. To prevent this, you have to enter immediately into the discursive spaces of your society. I mean by this, your social platforms, your media platforms, social media, physical platforms, all of these need to be controlled. Democracies cannot clamp down on media. Democracies cannot break up protests. If they do so, they risk slander in a way an autocracy does not have to fear, because this is the nature of an autocracy in the first place. We can go in, we can shut down media channels who are saying anything. We can try to curb the panic in its beginnings. I want you to note here, this is not a sustainable thing an autocracy does, but if we're able to stop it for 2 months, that's 2 more months before bank runs and capital flight. That's more time for our government to be able to take the necessary decisions to be able to solve things, crucially again buying us critical time to be able to deal with things. The next claim from opening opposition then is autocracies suffer social revolutions, and this is going to be a big problem. My response, so do democracies. They say, well, you're going to use military action inside democracies. My response, I wish you could. The problem is, again, you won't be able to marshal the military action necessary to control the recalcitrant elements inside your society. They're going to cause the crisis of confidence to go out of hand, causing, again, problems which you're unable to deal with. Autocracies don't have to worry about this because in the short term, they're able to take this sort of control and just clamp down on it. Again, yes, social revolution in the future possible, doesn't matter right now. Next issue then, I want to talk about long-term planning and why in the long term we are less likely to have recurring patterns of crises. What you need to note about crises is that they deeply unsettle the economy and can create systems which are in the long term cause them to recur for whatever reason because there's some sort of fundamental deficiency in your economy. Autocracies can make better long-term plans to deal with this. Firstly, they can do this better than democracies because they can, number one, take difficult steps like rationing and tax increases. Number two, they have more control, so they're able to just physically make these decisions. And number three, they foresee themselves in power for longer periods of times than democratic parties do, meaning they are capable of making long-term plans without being worried by being down by electoral incentives. I'll also now get into why they have more incentives to make long-term plans, but before that, closing. Opening.
So you haven't really explained as to why you have the technical expertise within autocracies, right? Where do you get the technocrats? Where are the people who actually listen and have the expertise to make these decisions?
Autocracies are actually likelier to have technocrats than democracies. A very simple reason for this: democracies vote in people based on popular opinion. Autocracies can put them in on the basis of whatever. I think you are likely to be able to make distinctly technocratic decisions just because you want your government to be staffed with a bunch of really intelligent people. If we also agree that autocracies usually staff elite people, I think elite people have a tendency towards being technocrats, which the common man does not, by virtue of the fact they're likely to have gone to Ivy Leagues, various top-tier universities. I don't think there's any reason to believe there's a technical knowledge deficit inside autocracies. Why do autocracies have more incentive to make good decisions? First of all, again, they see themselves in power. A democracy which is going through a crisis is going to start prepping for the next election because they know they're losing the coming one to the other party. And moreover, the next party is likely to flip the policy you made over here. So if there's a long-term policy change required to fix your economy, autocracies can make it. Democracies are going to start contradicting themselves and undermining what you did earlier. Secondly, democracies are going to require more public buy-in for this sort of thing. And thirdly, autocracies require you to be able to solve these economic crises long-term as well, because that is also what facilitates their own ability to run the country. If there's an economic crisis every few years, the autocracy can't run it. They also have a vested incentive to deal with it. Autocracies make better decisions, prevent panic, and can nip crises in the bud in a way democracies can only dream of. Extremely proud to propose.
Thanks, Speaker, for that fine speech. Now to end the top half debate, maybe have the DLO.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. 1 second. In all instances where it is the government in charge that created the crisis, we are better off, because when you have protests without the existential fear about your life, you're a lot more likely to put them out of power. Whenever you have the capacity of voting them out, we 100% are better. So the question that you have to ask at the top of this debate is who is more likely to create the crises to begin with? And that is the first thing that I want to start extending with. There are 4 reasons why autocracies are a lot more likely to create crises. First of all, because they have a lot less diversification in the economy, and in many instances, their resource management is absolutely shit. The reason for this is because in most instances, whenever you don't have like the present, and I'll deal with the whole privatization issue in a second, so this doesn't seem like a tension, but I think this will be quite clear. In many instances, because the government completely centralizes the use of resources, the granting of land and then the production within that land, in many instances, it means that whenever the government fails at actually planning the economy correctly, there is no one else in the economy that can take over. You really don't have the capacity for other actors to come in, and in many instances, because you want to make sure that you have complete control of your like country, you do not go through a lot of trade, for example. This also means that you do not have as much support from international organizations. That means that both before and during the times of crises, you just have billions of less amounts of money in subsidies, for example, to be able to give to farmers, for example, to be able to make sure that you have enough oil so that you can pay for other debt that you have occurred. So the main thing that we note here is that diversification is worse. Second of all, in many instances, it is because of corruption. The literal reason why Venezuela has been in a crisis for the last like 30 years is because they created massive hyperinflation because of the misallocation of resources from oil. This happened with Maduro, this happened with Chavez, and it is the reason why they haven't been able to come out of the crisis. Because in most instances, they were making, like the main thing that they care about is remaining in power. It is you and your friends in power, and all you have to do is retain the elites in your side. And so as long as you give them money, as long as you cut them checks that you do not inject into the economy, things are much worse. Thirdly, because there is less predictability. The reason why Zimbabwe went to absolute shit with Mugabe is because he very fastly seized land and he created a massive agricultural crisis. The reason why this happened is because they make decisions very fast, and in many instances they themselves have disincentives from listening to the technocrats that opening government is saying, for irrational reasons 100%. And so even if closing government gives you structural reasons, in many instances they don't give a shit about those structural reasons. They just make decisions that are very populist, for example, or that just like help their particular like group, right? Like within like the Chinese Communist Party, even if they are not economically sound. So in many instances you have worst crises, and what we do on our side is we have more likelihood of just taking them out. What we do is we just vote them out in many instances. What we do is just protest against them, and we have the capacity of moving forward. Why do we have more economic adaptability on our side? The first reason is because you have a lot more information flows, which are good for market confidence. The reason for this is that companies can, for example, give a lot more information about where they are spending, what they're doing, what their plan is. But most importantly, states can, for example, create like health and economic guidelines. This is one of the reasons why democracies in general were doing well, like we're able to recover from COVID. But the other reason is that you have significant buy-in from both sides during these types of crises. Here's the most important response, I think, to this part of the material from opening government. Democracies do have issues in passing policy, almost at any point, except in this debate. When it is significant times of crisis, you usually see parties run towards the middle. That is why you saw billions of dollars being spent on resources, just on expenditure that, for example, Republicans or right-wingers wouldn't have accepted in places like the US, in places like Israel. But the reason why they did in most instances is because there were incentives in order to recover from the crisis. Centralization in democracies is particularly important, and I think that those types of unions are a lot more likely to occur on our side of the house. I also want to be very clear that regimes can double down on restrictions, and this is very bad for freedom of speech. It is bad for freedom of movement. It is bad for freedom of spending, and it is really bad for the very significant identities that people carry with them. This is very important because in most instances, when there is an economic crisis, as an autocratic regime, you know that you are at risk. And so you have two choices as a country in general. Either you try and deal with people peacefully, or you just double down. And for these countries, they just don't have the mechanisms to be peaceful, right? Like, what do? Do you allow for people to freely associate? That is not in the constitution anyways. Do you allow for other countries to give you aid? Those countries probably fucking hate you because you're an autocrat, and that is not generally the trend of the international community. And so in most instances, what they do is they kill people on the streets. That is the reason why in most of Latin America, in Chile and in Argentina, the shock doctrine was literally looked like massively as autocracies, privatizing shit in many instances, trying to give money to the elites, because you know that people aren't going to change their mind. And if they were to change their mind, they would just vote you out. So the only thing that you can do is double down on oppression. This is by far the most important part of the debate. Even if proposition can prove to you that they have less crises, I think whenever you do have crises, it is at the cost of human lives. It is at the cost of regulations. And the main mechanism that I'll have here is that there is never an incentive to back down on those regulations. After the economic crisis, what usually happens in these countries is that those restrictions on human liberties usually remain, and that is bad for humans in a very long period of time. That is why in many autocracies, for this occurred because of crises that happened in the 70s, and those restraints on human liberties are still there. I want to be very clear about the whole thing that we say about privatization, because closing government is just 100% correct, right? To be very clear, we are talking about the countries that allow for privatization. In countries like the autocracies that do not allow for privatization, they wouldn't privatize. They would instead massively nationalize. But I think, like, I hope that it's very clear that there's just two different types of autocracies, right? So what happens with those types of autocracies, the ones that do privatize? In many instances, they make sure that they retain the elite. That is why Putin, during the Ukraine-Russia war, hasn't been like massively helping Russians, because the structural reason is that he doesn't want a revolution. He knows that that's not going to happen. What is an actual threat to Putin is the elites moving away. That is why the sanctions were going towards the elite. And so all Putin did, for example, is back down on the elites, give money to the elites at the cost of the average Russian. And so that is the reason why they were better off. I'll take a POI from closing. Cool. The next thing I want to talk about is the whole thing about like, so the general thing about like passing policy on their side. I want to be clear. In most instances, those incentives aren't good. So at best, open government proved that you can pass shit really fast. They didn't prove to you that they passed actually good policies. And I've given you the analysis on why the economic types of tendencies in autocracies are way worse. But here is the last thing. I think on our side of the house, you have significant capacity to hold individuals accountable, not just through the voting and protests that we've talked about, but also in terms of the companies where you are under. I think that whenever workers can freely associate during types of crises, whenever labor unions have power within these nations, it is a lot more likely that there are regulations. Whenever you just push out the inefficient leaders of corporations that were crucial to the economy. So for example, whenever like the oil industry or whenever the gas industry is privatized, this is quite useful. On their side of the house, it is often one government who, if they make mistakes, this trickles down to the entire economy. The main mechanism that you have to remember by comparing us to closings and to opening government is that we have diversification, is that things will be different and things will often be bad, but there is the capacity for improvement. On their side, if they fuck up forever, and they fuck up at the cost of human lives. For those reasons, we're very proud.
I thank the speaker for that fine speech. Now to extend the back half on behalf of the member of government.
Okay. I am going to start my speech. 1 second. I need a timer. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think it's a lie to say that countries like China or really any country with the kinds of resources that a country has at its fingertips, with billions upon billions upon billions of dollars, normally tens to hundreds of billions of dollars, cannot pay for experts or find someone who is smart enough to help them create good policies to get them out of recessions. The question is, who has the right incentives to do this in the average case when you're during times of economic crisis? And that's what we're going to show. We're going to show that at the end of the day, in democracies, we end up falling into populism during times of crisis, whereas and that populist policies make things far, far worse. And on the other hand, autocracies have significantly better incentives and less accountability to these kinds of populist demands. Okay, so let's get started. Why do we think that crises actually cause populism? One, I think that people are often very, like, during a crisis, it's not just that, oh, you know, kind of some cost of living has gone up. People have lost their job. There's a ton of uncertainty about what's going to happen in that country. Sometimes there's a lot of it's not just about capital controls. Like, it's not just that money's leaving. It's also the fact that a loaf of bread that used to cost 5 shekels now costs 1,000 shekels. You might need to take a suitcase in order to buy your daily groceries. There are riots and anger and a lot of different kinds of things like this. When people are angry, I think that oftentimes, or when these kinds of things happen and suddenly you've lost your life savings, you become very angry. This makes you far more vulnerable to narratives around things like the culpability of elites, minorities, and other kinds of scapegoats, which is often a key part of populism, because that's what focuses the blame on other people. And the fact that if you just listen to a single person with this kind of idea and he's blaming other people. So, for example, those immigrants are the reason who stole our job, are the reason you guys are now poor, and the reason we're in this situation. You're much more vulnerable to these kinds of narratives. But secondly, I also think that people just want simple answers. They've lost a lot, and they want that to have a simple reason and a simple solution. And preferably that solution doesn't sound too painful. It doesn't involve having to slash spending very severely. It doesn't involve losing their subsidies. It doesn't involve them having to give anything up. Thirdly, people feel like something has to be done right now. The current situation during a crisis is just untenable, and that means that we need a change, and often it needs a big change, so long as we feel it's going to be immediately helpful. And finally, you often lose trust in the government and experts who often made a mistake that led you to this kind of situation, which means you often demand a change from the existing system or a change from the existing experts rather than and holding those kinds of people to account. What this means is that oftentimes you fall prey to the worst kinds of populist policies when you have the choice to. What kind of policies? And this is a terrible idea, right? Because often, one, there's just a problem. There's a problem solution. Oftentimes there is a problem solution mismatch, right? Things may sound good to people, maybe because it hurts someone that you blame, like really, really taxing immigrants or making, or if it's the Brits who dislike, please don't unmute yourself, I'll ask for you, like the Brits may dislike immigrants and want them to not be able to enter, or they may hate the EU, but the EU isn't the reason that they're experiencing significant recession, and leaving the EU is going to make things much, much worse. But secondly, because it sounds like an easy solution. Normally, unfortunately, problems don't just have one simple solution and, oh, let's just fix this one, like flip a switch and things are better. It often involves, it may sound very nice to bring steel production back to the Rust Belt, but to be honest, doing that just hurts the economy. And normally what we should be doing is supporting other parts of the economy and replacing these jobs with sustainable ones, even though the miners who live in Ohio, that sucks for them, and they're going to be really, really pissed off. Secondly, often these are very, very extreme policies. They involve making widespread, sweeping changes, right? So, for example, if you're Argentina, right, until today you provide massive subsidies, right, that cause significant inflation, like a 30% inflation, and nobody really knows when you're going to, like, how these policies are going to go in the future and how many of them they're going to be, and it changes between governments a little bit, then this makes it much more difficult for you to actually get investments in the first place and creates a lot of instability and uncertainty, which significantly negatively affects the amount of external FDI you see. But secondly, they also just often have very bad side effects for the economy, right? When the French alt-right are currently leading in the polls with extremely populist financial policies, nobody understands how they're going to be able to pay for them, which means that which is going to just hurt France in general, obviously, and also another reason for which it hurts the FDI. So why do we think that autocracies in general have better incentives and less accountability to these populist demands? So number one, just like obviously they have the use of force, they don't have to listen to populist demands to a very large extent. But obviously that's not sufficient, because if things get bad enough without any prospect of things getting better, then yeah, maybe they may be overthrown or things like that. But notice, these are where the other kinds of incentives come in. Or people who are in charge for autocracies oftentimes are long-termist. They're not going to be replaced immediately in the next 6 months or 2 years or whenever the next election is. They're going to be replaced only if over time it seems like nothing is getting better and their policies are failing. But they do still fear the fact that if they don't do anything, they're going to be held to account by their public, because oftentimes their legitimacy comes through growth. It comes through the fact that they make promises that they actually follow through on. Think about the CCP. Xi Jinping's claim to power is the fact that life is getting better for the average Chinese person. And so the same in Singapore. And if it stops not for 5 years, we saw in COVID, they're willing to give it 5 years, but it stops for 10 years, then he's going to have a significant problem with 1 billion Chinese people. Before I continue to explain the rest of the reasons for this, I'll take a POI from opening.
Why were Libya, Venezuela, Russia, Chile, Zimbabwe some of the biggest populous nations on earth during literally what you're talking about, during these types of governments?
So, I mean, I think that Russia is still one of the biggest economies in the world. I just have no idea what you're talking about. Secondly, even if you can give me examples of dictatorships that did a bad job, like what about all of the democracies that did a terrible job, like Chile, Argentina, Bolivia, Peru, Colombia, basically all of Latin America, etc. Like that's just not how that works. Cool. Second, more reasons for why autocracies have better incentives. Also, I think that oftentimes the leader of the country cares about how he's going to be seen in hindsight. Putin wants to be remembered as a good leader, and I think that Xi Jinping does as well. But fourthly, I think that economic success often affects their power very directly. They are the country, and they get to decide how the country is used and behaves. When they are rich, when the country is richer, they are richer. They can project their power more effectively. They're far safer from foreign influence and don't have to worry about being overthrown or somebody invading them. They also just hate instability because that's where they're most at risk. On the other hand, democracies oftentimes don't have this kind of accountability. The accountability is for the worst kinds of populist policies that want immediate solutions for problems you can't solve immediately. It's politicians who weren't necessarily voted in on being able to solve economic crises and don't necessarily know how to do that. It's politicians who are short-termist, right? That's the reason Argentina could never solve its problems, and it had to wait like 30 years because nobody was willing to bite the bullet and tell the public, listen, you're going to have to suffer now. And finally, we think they're more captured by lobbyists. We've won this debate. Thank you so much.
I thank the speaker for that fine speech. May we have the member of opposition? Yep, loud and clear.
Just move the window over so I can see POIs. Look, to some degree in this debate, both sides are going to be hit by crisis because of external factors you can't control. You might have COVID happen. You might have a random supply chain issue having logjam at your ports. There's some degree to which economic crisis happening itself is something you cannot control. What we're going to tell you is two things. Firstly, why even if crisis happens on both sides and there's some capacity to address it, you are hit far harder in an autocracy. But secondly, we're going to tell you why democracies are far better at being able to address them. Let's start with why they're hit by crisis harder. Let's be charitable and say both sides have some ways to address these issues. We're going to prove why the hit on an individual person is much harder and more difficult to recover from. And this is how I want to weigh this argument. Even if life is hard on both sides of the house, the margin is, can you just about keep your home? Can you restart your business? Not doing so is an insanely intense impact on your life. It puts you back in a life of being destitute, which is impossible to recover from. Opening opposition stops at why these solutions won't work. We'll tell you why even if they do, the damage that is already done is so much more severe. So it is a far deeper harm than what opening opposition accomplishes. Firstly, there's limited feedback mechanisms. Opening government says that autocracies can spot things and put in fixes, as CG then extends on. But my question is, how do we spot them? Democracies benefit from a range of feedback mechanisms. They have free media who can call out these things as they spot them themselves, like The Economist being able to publicize what they see about the US's economic data. We have public opinion. We have opposition parties like canvassing on these things in order to get themselves into power. These things highlight economic problems and their potential early on to say, hey, look, that guy's running your country into the ground. But the comparative to this is that autocracies either lack these mechanisms or actively crack down against them. Look at China suppressing economic data that was coming out of their country. Why do they do this? They suppress this because it empowers opposing factions. They fear that they will be able to use this against them, or because it takes away investment and they fear starting a debt spiral. Mugabe suppressed information on hyperinflation conditions before they happened. China suppressed financial reports from Evergrande and the other big three housing companies. They always feel threatened, and so they want to make sure that info doesn't get out. Versus in democracies, they lack the option to do so in the first place. There's a severe margin to this argument. The difference between having and using this info and feeling the pressure to use this is having Brazil, who addressed their inflation crisis when it was way too late and had an interest rate spiral and people couldn't afford basic goods like bread, versus the US, who increased rates in times and slowed these things down. This is a logically prior mechanism to opening opposition because it shows that you have the ability to address these things in the first place. Secondly, you lack social safety nets because you don't need to appease a set of voters. Democracies tend to have large social safety nets. You have things like welfare. How many autocracies actually have robust social safety nets? The reason you don't have them is because you depend on a set of oligarchs who don't want people to have too much of a safety net because it means they can't exploit labor as much as they want because they have alternatives. This is the same with international investors who want cheap labor, and that labor is cheaper the less bargaining power that they have. So they make sure there's no social safety net. So if you're hit on crisis on both sides of the house, you have nothing to be able to pay your rent with. Third, investor confidence. Investors tend to be wary of autocratic regimes because there's a high risk of arbitrary decision-making and expropriation, stuff like Mugabe taking the land from all the white people. So during an economic crisis, that lack of investor confidence is exacerbated with that financial instability. The first places where you're going to cut off from your portfolio will be the developing world. It will be places that are hit harder by crisis. And so the fact that you have less control and less knowledge of the decision-making is the margin on whether or not you lose your money in the first place. So it means you have far less money to address the crisis. But fourth, you lack the resources to address the issue, both for the reason I already said, but firstly because corruption tends to blunt your ability to address this. Manuel says Maduro and Chavez did corruption, but they don't say why corruption actually hurts your ability to address the crisis, which is often you have to cut things like subsidies for farms, for example, while you need to help other people instead, like the people who you depend on, like local oligarchs or warlords. The comparative is, even if this is an important demographic, a state of emergency, which you can impose as a democracy to be able to make fast decisions, noting that opposite government needs to respond to this being something you can do, means that you can just impose these regulations, take away some kind of important subsidy, and then justify it based off of the fact that we solved the crisis faster than other nations would have, so we kept you safer and we kept you more fed. But also, states will often excessively spend on things like security forces or patronage networks at the expense of essential economic investments like infrastructure or education. What's the end conclusion of all of this? Crisis meaningfully hurts you more as an individual person. Even if you bounce back, even if things get better, damage is greater and more irreversible because of the mechanisms that exist within autocracies. Secondly, let's talk about democracies being better at addressing crisis. OO tells you why autocracies are bad at this stuff, but not the unique ways in which they're actually good at addressing this in democracies. So if GovBench mitigates the shit out of OO, they'll probably win over them. But we're resilient to that and tell you the unique efficacy of democracies. Firstly, long-termism, directly addressing Gishai. You as a politician don't want to do things that are long-term destructive because you have long-term ambitions of power. You don't don't want to be the one that lost the country for like massive economic harms. You don't want to be the one that was responsible for lives on your hands. This is why Boris Johnson and the Conservatives will never be re-electable. So the long-termist incentive of wanting to stay in power and not damage your political legacy is why you're not going to do damaging policies. There is long-termism within democracies. Secondly, you have more robust civil services. If you're in an autocracy, you don't have to intend on changing your civil service because there's no change in power. So you pack these with cronies. It's the easiest way to get people on your payroll, so you have worse people. But also, in a democracy, you know, power changes, and so in every 4 years, it's unsustainable for you to substitute out all your technocrats, so you don't change out your civil service. But also, there's less politicization because a civil service is far less important to the hold of power in a democracy because they aren't as important in rolling out decisions. Politicians make those decisions, versus in an autocracy, they have significant power in rolling out what's made. So this means that the civil service is much more independent and robust in a democracy. What does this mean? You have the information in the first place. You detect economic data and find the ways to find the best policy solutions. So regardless of who is in power, even if Yishai is correct that some kind of crazy populist is going to come to power, you need the solutions that you would choose from, the ability to address and make the right choice. The precondition for this is the right data and research and proposals. Do we do stimulus through borrowing or do we cut taxes? These are difficult and subjective decisions. We only have the best answers through a democracy creating a robust civil service. Even if you have the smart people, you put them in the right places with the right power on our side. Opening, please.
In a democracy, once a party replaces a party which was present in government during a crisis, they're likely to want to change all of the policies that party made because it's the only way to prove that they're trying to do something different. Autocracies are able to make...
I'm cutting you off now. So I think Lucy will address this robustly, but the immediate question I have is how many elections do you have during a time of crisis? Usually you have a state of emergency where you suspend things like elections and the ruling party just does stuff until you resume parliament when the crisis ends. Let's talk about then why democracies are more liquid. Oftentimes you need to arbitrarily constrain liquidity because you as the Saudi government, for example, want to give out things like loans selectively to people who you politically prefer and don't give power to people who you don't like. But also, you don't give out things like subsidies and stimulus because your cronies fear that those things could be pocketed by other people. So it gives more power to demand things against you. So they oppose those kinds of things. Why does that matter? You need liquidity. You can't borrow because no one trusts you during that crisis. So you end up with a spiral when borrowing cost goes up. You lack confidence into investment. We have what fixes this issue. We have more liquidity. You don't lose out money in these arbitrary ways which curb your ability to address crises in the future. So democracies are far better at doing so. But lastly, because you don't have an incentive to extract money from society, and because you develop human capital in a democracy, democracies tend to perform better economically, so you're more resilient to crisis happening in the first place. Democracies, we've proven, have a variety of important ways to address crisis, which is why we should win the debate.
I thank the speaker for that fine speech, and now to end the CG case.
Okay, so no.
לא מספיק הקשבתי.
אוקיי, אני אדבר.
לא להתנצל.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
I need this, I need this. Okay, cool. Starting in 3, 2, 1. The biggest democracy in the world right now is India. The reason I'm saying this is not just because of my weird interest in India, but because I think a lot of this debate is based on weird assertions about what is or isn't part of being an autocracy or a democracy, which is not at all inherent. Panel, a lot of people in this debate have a bias to think of the classic example for a democracy being the US and the classic example for a autocracy being like North Korea. I want you to keep in mind that in the real world, there are plenty of democracies that are poor and corrupt, like India, like Brazil, like Argentina, like Poland. And there are plenty of autocracies that are stable, that have a lot of money, and have relatively good functions, such as China, such as Singapore, such as Vietnam. We really don't think being rich or being corrupt is an inherent characteristic of either democracies or autocracies. Why does it matter? Because I want you to note that in the entirety of members of opposition speech, there was actually very little analysis to back the premises for their cases. They analyze very nicely why once there is corruption, it's bad for the economy. without explaining why autocracies are more corrupt. They analyze very nicely why, if a country is richer, it has better resources to get out of crisis, without ever telling us why democracies are richer. Panel, the UAE and Saudi Arabia are autocracies. They are filthy rich. They say that in autocracies, you have lower investors' confidence. They gave no reason for this. They say, look at Mugabe. Sure, because the most common case of an autocracy is Mugabe. We have no idea why their case isn't purely incidental and only based on examples. And it would be a bit too late if the entirety of the analysis for why what they claim is likely comes only in WIP. By the way, all of the rebuttal to our case will surely come only in WIP because we got zero engagement from members, so I really hope they take our POI to give us any chance of engagement. That being said, two clashes in this debate. One, which government or which government system has better incentives during time of crisis? Two, which government system has better capacity? I want to start by weighing why we care significantly more about incentives, and then I'll show why we win incentives and lessly engage capacity. Firstly, why do we think the incentives of governments should matter more in this debate than the capacity of governments? Few reasons. One, they are largely logically prior. Having the capacity to make a policy that is good does not mean that you will make it. HUJI claims that autocracies have better capacity to deal with things such as civil unrest or legislate. And we agree. But OO tells them that this is bad because they will use their capacity for evil and to help elites and corporations. Similarly, CO analyzes why democracies might have better capacity because of riches or whatnot to help their people. But they never analyze why they will use the riches to help their people and not to do Trump economics or Poland economics or Argentina economics that already happen in many democracies. Capacity alone is worth nothing if you don't have good incentives. Secondly, because we think incentives are much more inherent, and this is crucial. Panel, this debate is very messy for one simple reason. There are a gazillion different autocracies and there are a gazillion different democracies, and they have a lot of differences between them. Any claim about capacity is going to be heavily impacted by the specific context of the country. A democracy like India would have extremely low capacity because they have a lot of suburbs that they are not able to reach, because they have relatively weak government, because they have relatively weak police force. Similarly, a government like Mexico is not able to enforce most of its laws. It is outdone by drug cartels. Other democracies might have better capacity, like the US, which is practically a police state. Capacity is heavily impacted by your police force, by your budget, by many things that are not inherent. Incentives, and particularly the populistic incentives the HUJI analyzes, are inherent because they are a direct result of the incentive to be re-elected or the absence thereof. And thirdly, we think that lacking capacity, at worst, means that you leave the crisis as is. At the lowest capacity, you do nothing. Bad incentives make active harm. If you have bad incentives, you can make the crisis worse. You can do things like energy price caps, like the UK did during a time of energy shortage, which makes the shortage worse because people then consume more energy because it's cheaper, but it does not fix the supply problem. You can do things like overspending during times of inflation to give people more welfare, to feel like the inflation is taken easily on them, but that makes the inflation worse. So we show active harm, not just making the crisis not resolved. Before I continue, opening.
You can't ignore the Mex and then say we didn't provide them. They are more corrupt because they need to buy the elite to remain in power, and even if both are corrupt, we can vote them out. Democracies usually don't kill their population. You do, and you should have responded to that thus far.
Okay, democracies, I don't know. One, I think autocracies usually don't kill most of their civilians. This is like the extreme minority of political oppositions. We really don't think this is the likely case that you are this particular person. Two, of course, democracies kill their people. Ask an average African American how they feel safe around the police. I really don't get this case. Still sounds like an assertion, which is very much dependent on the state that you live in and not inherent in any way to democracies or autocracies. Cool. The only claim we get to counter us on incentives is when OO says elites capture in autocracies, and this is why you lack accountability and you have bad incentives. Two issues. One, OO asserts that accountability is good, which is asserting that voters vote for good policies. Ishai analyzes why during times of crisis, voters vote for bad policies, hence I don't care. Secondly, we think that corporate power is worse in most democracies for a very simple reason. When you have freer markets without the government control, corporations get bigger and richer and have more power for lobbyism that is impacting elections results. So we think this is highly symmetric. Lastly, some independent rebuttals on capacity. CO tells us that you lack feedback loop mechanisms. Few answers to this. One, the fact that you don't allow the public opinion or press doesn't mean that you don't have internal mechanisms and that internally you know what you have in shortage. Two, you can look internationally. I can look at prices in other countries to get signals for shortages, even if I don't have them in my own country. Beg you to propose.
I thank the speaker for that fine speech, and now to end this debate, maybe have the opposite.
Can you hear me and see me?
Yes, you both.
2 seconds. I actually fully agree with Hadar that example trading is not useful, which is why I think like noting repeatedly Liz Truss did bad things and what about Argentina should not be credited exactly for the reasons that she's given you. And which is why HUJI was structural, and I'm going to flag where, and did respond to them, and I trust you that you tracked it, but I'm going to flag it as well. First thing I want to talk about is why you are hit by the crisis much harder. The first thing we explained is the lack of confidence. And the structural reason, funnily, comes from opening government, because they say, well, you could like freeze stuff from the foreign investors as their big mechanism. If that's true, then they wouldn't have any of that confidence in the first place. Which foreign investor will invest in a country that, as per opening government, will freeze all their shit whenever there is a crisis? That's exactly the reason why that confidence doesn't exist. Second, we explained why you have less data and knowledge. The response that like you can look somewhere else, we explained you have far less of it because you lack the infrastructure democracies have per the just by definition on how democracies function. And that's why sometimes having corporate influence and stuff like that is quite useful, because then you're able to communicate with the private corporations who can give you that data. The second thing we explained is that you have less safety nets, very crucial to the individual person who is living under a crisis. This is not about like if they are richer or if they are poorer, because obviously there are differences. But we explain structurally that autocrats compared to democrats do not have to be providing the same level of safety nets of welfare, unresponded to, explained why you are hit as an individual by crisis much harder. I don't have to weigh it because HUJI did loads of weighing about why this is a prerequisite for all the other claims. This all stands. Let's talk about incentives. Opening government explains that you could be making quick choices. We will contest that as well. But they don't explain why they have the incentive to be doing good stuff. They have few things on this. They say, well, you care about the common man as well. That might be a thing that you care about. The question is why they would be prioritizing it compared to all the other incentives. Because think about an autocratic regime, and this is where we explain it again. This is structural, right? Because you as an autocrat, all you need and what's safe for you is to be able to get money for yourself, to have money for the elites that are propping you up, and have money for a military that is able to crack down on public support. All notes this, but importantly, they don't explain why there is a trade-off and tension with the solving crisis mechanisms. Why you can't be sustaining elites, but why you can also be benefiting the common folk. Why don't you just do like the one good thing that benefits everyone? We explain this because often things like taking loans, or says maybe you don't get loans, they don't take those loans for a very, very long time because they often come with some form of conditionality. They often require you to liberalize. You need to be giving up some of your power in order to access those resources. That's why democracies will be richer and will have more resources for that reason. Secondly, we explain how you have to divert money from the groups that you care about because you do have limited liquidity. So often you would need to be taking money from the people that are benefiting you more, giving it to people. Because of that, you have an incentive not to be solving the crisis for a very prolonged period of time, not implement solutions that will be helping, because the safe thing for you to do is to make sure that you are pondering on the people and on yourself. That is the safe option. And secondly, you do have alternatives, right? You are not forced to be benefiting people for reasons that HUJI also gives you. Media control, they agree. That's horrible because you can afford to keep the crisis going for a very, very long time before any accountability, before actually anyone sees what like the shit that is happening everywhere. Things like repression, scapegoating, right? The media control is exactly why scapegoating without being contradicted, without anyone criticizing, is the easiest thing to do on closing government. Because like because then that's the easiest way that you can justify not doing anything and cracking down on someone that you are able to scapegoat. What that means is that the incentive is not to be solving the crisis effectively for a very long period of time. It's like take ages to solve the crisis. By the time it often spirals. Closing government then has the claim about why, it's a quite smart claim, but we responded to it. Why are you going to be making worse decisions or worse incentives on democracies? They say populism. They say you're going to do policies that sound good, but are bad. We responded to it. First, they just gave examples, but think about it, right? Governments also care about long term. Maybe you have a prime minister. This is really important. Maybe prime minister who's going to retire in 4 years. Maybe they don't care. But everyone else in that government, everyone else in all the parties cares about long term because you want to become prime minister in the future. You don't want to be the person who fucked up the economy for 30 years. Congressmen who don't have term limits, they want to be getting re-elected. You don't want to be doing the stupidest thing that is going to maybe help in the very, very short term, but in the long term, it's going to make the crisis worse and worse because then you're never going to be electable again. Because of that, we are having this sweet spot, right? You need to address the needs of the people because of electoral incentives. That is good, that benefits the individual. That is something that the autocracies don't have, but you won't be fucking stupid and making stupid decisions that are going to destroy the country's economy for the reasons that I just described, because you also have long-term incentives. And the response that we get from that is very little. They just say, well, Argentina maybe does stupid things. But again, this is a structural analysis about why you are on comparative far more likely to be making smart decisions. Before I talk about the capacity, I will take opening government because we did respond.
Autocracies have the same incentive to fix these crises that the Gulf states and China have to have incredible social welfare for their citizens. It's the only way to prevent dissent and subversive activity.
I literally just described to you that there is an easier way to prevent dissent, right? You can use your media control, you can use your military. Often the making sure that the populace is good and doesn't dissent by economic policies would be something that would be in tension with the incentives and the safe things that the autocratic regime wants. That was literally just what I just described. On capacity, opening government says political parties are going to be blocking one another. One, not like legislation doesn't need to go through Congress during economic crises, like often is just done by governments. That's like a reason why, like we know that these things need to be done quickly. But even if you don't buy it, no one has the incentive to not solve the crisis. Opposition party doesn't want to be inheriting screwed up economy because it's very hard to implement any policies they want to be implementing once they inherited a screwed up economy. Opposition parties often know that they might come into power after an economic crisis, so they want to make sure that it's reasonably resolved so that they are able to implement good stuff. So the next thing on capacity about technical knowledge, we also explain that over opening up. HUJI responds that, well, you changing people all the time, technocrats, and you can choose it based on something in autocracies. We explain it. In democracies, you obviously don't swap civil service every 4 years. That would be stupid. No party has an incentive to do that. That's why you have technocrats who are professionals. The comparative is crucial because you pack it with cronies because that's the easiest way to put your friends on the government payroll. That's why they are incompetent. On incentives, on capacity, and when you have hit harder, closing opposition wins on all of those counts.